Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Steel. Dexter Coffey moved through the emergency room with the precision of a blade cutting through flesh. 23 years of trauma surgery had carved away every soft edge from his soul, leaving behind a man who viewed the world through the lens of damage assessment and calculated repair. His colleagues at Sacred Heart Medical Center respected his surgical prowess, but few truly knew the depths of his methodical nature, a trait that extended far beyond the operating table. At 47, Dexter commanded respect through competence rather than charm. His graying temples and steady hands told the story of countless lives saved and lost under his watch. He'd learned early that emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford when lives hung in the balance. This philosophy had served him well in surgery, but it had cost him his marriage to Loretta. Loretta Coffey, now Loretta Wolf, had been his college sweetheart, a vibrant psychology major who'd been drawn to his intensity. For 12 years, they'd built what seemed like a solid life together. She'd supported him through medical school and residency, and he'd provided the stability she craved. Their son Mark had been the crown jewel of their union, a bright 10-year-old who inherited his father's analytical mind and his mother's warm spirit. The divorce 3 years ago had been swift and clinical, much like Dexter's surgical procedures. Loretta had met Zane Wolf at the gym where she'd started working as a therapist. Zane was everything Dexter wasn't: spontaneous, physically imposing, and emotionally expressive. At 34, the former UFC middleweight had parlayed his fighting career into a successful chain of mixed martial arts academies across the state. What had cut deepest wasn't Loretta's infidelity. Dexter had seen it coming in the increasing distance between them. What had severed any possibility of forgiveness was her immediate remarriage to Zane and the casual way she'd moved Mark into their new life, as if their son was just another piece of furniture to be relocated. The custody arrangement gave Dexter every other weekend and alternating holidays. He'd accepted this with the same stoic determination he brought to removing cancerous tumors. Sometimes you had to cut away what you loved to save what mattered most. Mark remained his priority, the one person in the world for whom Dexter would sacrifice everything. Tonight, as he reviewed patient charts in his office, Dexter reflected on the man he'd become. Some called him cold. He preferred precise. Some saw his methodical approach to problems as obsessive. He knew it as thorough. These weren't flaws to him. They were tools, instruments as sharp and reliable as the scalpels he wielded. His phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Dad, can't wait for this weekend. Mom says maybe we can go to the Science Museum." Dexter smiled, one of the few genuine expressions he allowed himself. His son shared his love of understanding how things worked, of taking apart complex systems to see their inner mechanisms. As he prepared to leave for the night, Dexter considered how much Mark had grown. At 13 now, his son was developing the kind of logical thinking that made Dexter proud. Mark asked good questions, observed details others missed, and approached problems with methodical patience. In another life, Dexter might have guided him toward medicine. But given the boy's fascination with engineering and robotics, perhaps Mark would find his own path to precision. The irony wasn't lost on Dexter that his greatest strength, his ability to remain emotionally detached while solving complex problems, had cost him his marriage. But it was that same trait that made him one of the most sought-after trauma surgeons in the state. When other doctors lost their nerve in the face of massive trauma, Dexter found clarity. When others hesitated, he acted with decisive certainty. As he walked to his car through the hospital parking garage, Dexter reflected on a conversation he'd had with his mentor years ago. Dr. Raymond Leach had told him that the best surgeons were those who could switch off their humanity when necessary, who could see past the person to the problem that needed solving. At the time, Dexter had thought this was about medical procedures. He was beginning to understand that this philosophy extended to all of life's complications. Chapter 2. The Revelation. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Dexter was used to emergency calls. They were part of his life, but the paramedic's voice carried an unusual urgency. "Dr. Coffey, We're bringing in a 13-year-old male, multiple fractures. The Guardian specifically requested you handle the case. Dexter was already reaching for his clothes. ETA, 6 minutes out. Doc, the Guardian is Zane Wolfe. Says the kid is your son. The words hit Dexter like a physical blow, but his training kicked in immediately. Personal feelings had no place in trauma medicine. By the time he reached the ER, he was in full professional mode. His emotions locked away behind the same mental barriers he used when operating on mangled car accident victims. The ambulance doors opened, and Dexter's world tilted on its axis. Mark lay unconscious on the gurney, his left arm visibly deformed, his face pale and bruised. Zane Wolfe followed close behind, his massive frame filling the ambulance doorway. To any observer, Zane appeared appropriately concerned. Worried stepfather rushing to help his injured stepson. What happened? Dexter asked, his voice steady as he began his initial assessment. Kid fell down the stairs, Zane said, his tone carrying just the right note of parental anxiety. I heard this crash around midnight. Found him at the bottom of our staircase, barely conscious. Poor kid must have been sleepwalking. Dexter's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Mark's vitals, assessing the damage. Multiple fractures in the left arm, possible concussion, extensive bruising along the ribcage. His son stirred slightly, mumbling incoherently. Mark, Dexter said softly. Can you hear me? You're safe now. Mark's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. For just a moment, when he saw his father, something flickered across his face. Not relief, but something closer to fear. His gaze darted quickly to Zane, then back to Dexter. Dad! Mark's voice was barely a whisper. I'm here. We're going to take care of you. As the nursing team prepared Mark for x-rays, Dexter pulled Zane aside. The MMA fighter towered over him by 6 inches and outweighed him by at least 60 pounds of muscle. But Dexter had spent years dealing with various types of intimidation, and size had never impressed him. Tell me exactly what you saw, Dexter said. Zane's story was consistent, too consistent. Mark had apparently fallen down 13 stairs, landing hard on his left side. The stepfather had found him quickly and called 911 immediately. Every detail sounded rehearsed, delivered with the kind of casual precision that came from repetition. 30 minutes later, Dexter stood in the imaging room, staring at Mark's x-rays with growing rage. But it wasn't the white-hot anger of impulse. It was the cold, calculating fury of a man who'd found a tumor that needed to be cut out completely. The fractures told a story that had nothing to do with falling downstairs. The breaks in Mark's arm showed clear signs of torque. Someone had twisted his arm with significant force. The rib fractures were localized in a pattern consistent with focused, blunt force trauma. These weren't the injuries of a tumbling fall. They were the injuries of systematic violence. Dr. Esther Myers, the radiologist on duty, joined him at the viewing screen. Dexter, these don't look like fall injuries. No, he agreed quietly. They don't. Are you going to? I'll handle it. Esther nodded and left him alone with the evidence. In any other situation, Dexter would already be on the phone with Child Protective Services and the police. The protocol was clear, the legal requirements straightforward. But as he stared at the x-rays, other thoughts crowded his mind. The legal system was slow, cumbersome, and uncertain. Even with clear evidence of abuse, there were no guarantees. Zane Wolfe was a respected businessman with resources and connections. Loretta would undoubtedly stand by her husband, perhaps even claim Mark was lying or confused. The case could drag on for months while his son remained in that house, subject to whatever punishment Zane might devise for triggering an investigation. Dexter thought about the pattern of the injuries, the careful placement that avoided areas that would be immediately visible. This wasn't the first time. This was practiced, methodical abuse designed to stay hidden. How long had Mark been suffering in silence? As he returned to Mark's bedside, his son was more alert but clearly in pain despite the medication. Zane had stepped out to call Loretta, leaving them momentarily alone. Mark, Dexter said gently, I need you to tell me what really happened. Mark's eyes darted toward the door, then back to his father. I fell down the stairs, Dad, just like Zane said. But Dexter had spent years reading the subtle signs of distress in patients who couldn't speak for themselves. Mark's body language, the way his breathing changed when he mentioned Zane's name, the almost imperceptible flinch when footsteps approached the room, it all painted a clear picture. When Zane returned with Loretta in tow, Dexter watched his ex-wife's performance. She was genuinely distraught about Mark's injuries, but there was something else in her demeanor, a subtle deference to Zane, a careful modulation of her responses when he was present. She'd become someone Dexter barely recognized, shaped by 3 years of living with a man who used violence as a tool of control. As he admitted Mark for observation and surgery to repair the fractures, Dexter made his decision. The legal system had protocols and procedures designed to protect children. But sometimes the system failed. Sometimes the only justice available was the kind you created yourself. Standing in the quiet of the surgical prep room, Dexter began to plan. He'd spent his career understanding how to dismantle complex problems, how to identify the precise point where intervention would be most effective. Now he would apply those same skills to a different kind of surgery, one that would remove the cancer threatening his son's life with the same ruthless precision he brought to saving lives. Some tumors required delicate treatment. Others needed to be cut out completely, ensuring they could never grow back. Chapter 3: The Architect of Revenge. 3 weeks after Mark's accident, Dexter had transformed his home study into a war room. To any casual observer, it looked like a dedicated father researching his son's medical care, medical journals, treatment protocols, specialist referrals. But hidden beneath the legitimate paperwork was something far more methodical, a comprehensive psychological and tactical profile of Zane Wolfe. Dexter had always believed that knowledge was the sharpest scalpel in any surgeon's toolkit. Understanding anatomy, physiology, and pathology allowed him to cut with precision rather than hope. Now he applied that same principle to understanding his enemy. Zane Wolfe, born Zachariah Patton Wolfe in Detroit, had climbed from the underground fighting circuits to professional MMA through a combination of natural talent and calculated brutality. His fighting style favored ground control and submission holds, techniques that required patience and methodical application of pressure until opponents surrendered. The parallel to what he was doing to Mark wasn't lost on Dexter. The MMA fighter's 3 academy locations generated substantial income. But Dexter's investigation revealed something more interesting. Zane's reputation in the fighting community was built as much on intimidation as skill. Former sparring partners spoke carefully about training sessions that crossed the line from intense to abusive. 2 former students had filed assault complaints that mysteriously disappeared before reaching court. More importantly, Dexter had identified Zane's pressure points. The man's ego was intrinsically tied to his reputation as an unbeatable fighter and successful businessman. His relationship with Loretta provided him with social legitimacy and respectability he'd never possessed before. And his academy empire was built on a carefully cultivated image of controlled strength and professional discipline. Dexter's plan would systematically destroy each pillar supporting Zane's life. The first phase required a delicate touch. During Mark's recovery visits, Dexter had observed the family dynamics with clinical precision. Loretta was genuinely unaware of the extent of Zane's violence toward Mark, but she'd been psychologically conditioned to accept his version of events without question. The fear she exhibited was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to read patient distress signals. Dexter's research into domestic abuse patterns had been educational. Controllers like Zane isolated their victims from support networks, made them financially dependent, and gradually eroded their confidence in their own perceptions. Loretta had been systematically cut off from her old friends. Her career had been redirected to support Zane's business interests, and she'd been convinced that her emotional reactions were inappropriate or excessive. The plan's elegance lay in its use of Zane's own methods against him. Where Zane used physical dominance and psychological manipulation, Dexter would use precision and misdirection. Where Zane operated through fear, Dexter would work through controlled revelation of truth. Phase 1 involved Mark's continued medical treatment. As the boy's physician, Dexter had legitimate reasons for regular contact and documentation of his recovery. Each visit allowed him to build a detailed record of Mark's psychological state, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the Wolf household dynamics. Mark was intelligent enough to understand that his father was planning something, though Dexter never explicitly confirmed this. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his son's confidence and teaching him subtle methods of self-protection. Mark learned to document incidents, to create evidence trails, and to recognize the early warning signs of Zane's escalating anger. "Dad," Mark had asked during one visit, "why didn't you call the police when you saw my x-rays?" Dexter considered his answer carefully. His son deserved honesty, but not the complete truth, because sometimes the system doesn't move fast enough to protect the people we love. Sometimes we have to create our own solutions. Phase 2 would target Zane's professional reputation. Dexter had made contact with Orlando Acevedo, a former UFC fighter now working as a sports journalist. Orlando had been investigating allegations of training abuse in MMA academies across the state. With the right information and encouragement, his investigation could expand to include Zane's methods. Dexter had also identified Dr. Aubrey McKinney, a sports medicine physician who treated many of Zane's students. A few careful conversations about concerning injury patterns among Wolf Academy students might prompt a more thorough examination of training protocols. The most crucial element was timing. Dexter understood that rushing would create opportunities for Zane to adapt and defend. Like any surgical procedure, success depended on creating the right conditions before making the decisive cut. Phase 3 would be the end game. A carefully orchestrated confrontation that would force Zane into a position where his true nature would be exposed in a way that left no room for plausible denial or legal maneuvering. Dexter had identified the perfect setting. The charity exhibition match Zane was scheduled to headline next month, a high-profile event designed to showcase his academy's community involvement. As Dexter finalized his preparations, he reflected on how much he'd changed since Mark's hospitalization. The man who'd approached problems with clinical detachment had been replaced by something more focused, more purposeful. He wasn't driven by anger. Anger was inefficient and created mistakes. He was driven by the same clarity of purpose that guided him through complex surgeries. Some colleagues might call his planned actions extreme, even unethical. But Dexter had spent years watching the legal system fail vulnerable patients, had seen bureaucracy protect institutions while individuals suffered. Mark was his responsibility, and he would fulfill that responsibility with the same unwavering commitment he brought to saving lives. The difference was that this time, he wasn't trying to save a life. He was trying to destroy one. His phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Feeling better today, Dad. Thanks for everything." The message was followed by a photo of Mark working on a robotics project, his arms still in a cast, but his expression focused and determined. Dexter smiled as he looked at the image. His son was healing, growing stronger despite everything Zane had done to break him. That resilience would serve Mark well in the weeks ahead, because Dexter's plan would inevitably create chaos before it restored order. As he closed his files and prepared for bed, Dexter felt the familiar calm that preceded his most difficult surgeries. Everything was prepared, every variable accounted for, every possible complication considered. Tomorrow, he would begin the most important operation of his career, one where failure wasn't an option, and success would require the complete excision of Zane Wolf from their lives. Chapter 4. The Trap is Set. 6 weeks after Mark's hospitalization, Dexter stood in the crowded sports bar adjacent to Zane's flagship academy, watching his target hold court among a group of admirers. The Wolf Pack, as Zane's inner circle called themselves, represented everything Dexter despised about the MMA culture: manufactured toughness, performative masculinity, and the worship of violence as entertainment. Tonight, Dexter wasn't Dr. Coffey, respected trauma surgeon. He was David Mercer, Loretta's concerned cousin, who'd recently moved to town and was interested in martial arts training. The identity had been carefully constructed over the past month, complete with social media history and references from a gym in Denver, all meticulously fabricated. Zane Wolf. Dexter approached the group with calculated nervousness. "I'm David Mercer. My cousin Loretta said you might have time to talk about training. Zane turned, his predator's instincts immediately assessing this potential new student. At first glance, David Mercer appeared to be exactly the type of client Zane preferred. Wealthy, middle-aged, and insecure about his masculinity. The expensive watch, designer workout clothes, and soft physique all painted the picture of a man desperate to buy the confidence he'd never earned. Loretta's cousin. Zane's voice boomed with practiced enthusiasm. She mentioned you might stop by. Looking to learn some real fighting skills. Well, I've been thinking about it since my divorce, Dexter said, allowing his voice to carry just the right note of masculine embarrassment. My ex-wife said I was too soft, too passive. I figured maybe it was time to, toughen up. The group exchanged knowing looks. This was familiar territory. Another soft executive looking to transform himself through proximity to violence. Zane's eyes gleamed with the anticipation of an easy mark. We get a lot of guys like you, Zane said, clapping a heavy hand on Dexter's shoulder. Successful in business, but never learned to stand up for themselves where it really matters. Don't worry, brother. We'll fix that. For the next hour, Dexter played his role perfectly. He asked naive questions about fighting techniques, expressed admiration for Zane's accomplishments, and gradually revealed details about his fictional divorce that painted him as both wealthy and emotionally vulnerable. Every word was calculated to appeal to Zane's ego while positioning himself as the ideal victim. The thing is, Dexter confided as the evening wound down, I don't just want to learn a fight. I want to understand the mindset. What separates winners from losers, Loretta always said you had this incredible mental toughness. Zane's chest visibly swelled. This was his favorite topic, the psychological dominance that made him superior to weaker men. It's about understanding power dynamics, David. Most people go through life as sheep, waiting for someone stronger to tell them what to do. But some of us are wolves. We take what we want and protect what's ours. That's exactly what I need to learn, Dexter said eagerly. When can I start? As they scheduled training sessions, Dexter carefully planted the seeds of his larger plan. He mentioned his substantial divorce settlement, his successful consulting business, and his search for investment opportunities. By the time they parted ways, Zane was already calculating how much money he could extract from this new student. Phase 1 was working perfectly. Over the following weeks, Dexter became a regular presence at the academy. His progress as a student was deliberately mediocre, good enough to avoid suspicion, poor enough to feed Zane's ego. More importantly, he established himself as a reliable source of validation and potential income. During this time, Dexter observed everything. He documented Zane's training methods, noting when intensity crossed into abuse. He identified which students were most vulnerable to Zane's psychological manipulation. He mapped the academy's financial structure, staff relationships, and operational vulnerabilities. Most crucially, he began to understand Zane's relationship with power. The MMA fighter wasn't just physically abusive. He was psychologically sophisticated in his methods of control. He identified each person's insecurities and exploited them systematically. With students, he alternated between praise and humiliation. With staff, he used financial dependence and job insecurity. With Loretta, he employed isolation and emotional manipulation. But Dexter also identified Zane's weaknesses. The man's ego required constant feeding. His sense of superiority depended on surrounding himself with people he could dominate. Most importantly, his carefully constructed public image was essential to his business success and social standing. During his third week of training, Dexter arranged to meet Orlando Acevedo for coffee. The sports journalist was exactly as Dexter had expected, intelligent, principled, and frustrated by the culture of silence that protected abusive trainers. I've been hearing stories about some of the MMA academies in this area, Dexter said carefully. As someone new to the sport, it's hard to know what's normal intensity and what crosses the line. Orlando leaned forward with interest. Which gym are you training at? Wolf Academy. Zane seems like a good coach, but some of the training methods seem intense. Zane Wolf, Orlando repeated thoughtfully. I've heard his name come up in some conversations. Nothing concrete, but there are whispers. You've seen questionable things. Dexter described several incidents he'd witnessed, all real, all documented, all carefully presented as the observations of a concerned novice rather than targeted accusations. Orlando took notes, his journalist instincts clearly engaged. Would you be willing to go on record if I decided to investigate? Orlando asked. I prefer to stay anonymous, Dexter said. I'm still training there, and I don't want to create problems. But if other people came forward, I understand. Thanks for bringing this to my attention. As Orlando left, Dexter smiled. The journalist would begin his investigation within days, driven by his own sense of professional duty rather than any external pressure. When the story eventually broke, it would be Orlando's initiative, not outside manipulation. Phase 2 was accelerating ahead of schedule. That evening, Dexter received a text from Mark. Had another session with the counselor today. Feeling stronger. Love you, Dad. The message was followed by a photo of Mark's latest engineering project, a robotic arm he designed to help people with mobility limitations. Looking at his son's creation, Dexter felt a surge of pride mixed with renewed determination. Mark was healing, but the threat remained. Every day his son spent in that house was another day at risk. The time for subtle manipulation was ending. It was time to move to Phase 3. Chapter 5. The Wolf Circle. 2 months into his infiltration of Zane's world, Dexter had become exactly what he'd pretended to be, a trusted member of the inner circle. His transformation from soft executive to dedicated student had been carefully calibrated to feed Zane's ego while positioning himself for the final phase of his plan. The charity exhibition match was 3 weeks away, and Zane's preparation had intensified to an almost manic level. The event would showcase the Wolf Academy's community involvement while raising money for local youth programs. A perfect opportunity for Zane to demonstrate his public persona as a positive role model and successful businessman. What Zane didn't know was that Dexter had been quietly orchestrating the conditions for his downfall. Orlando Acevedo's investigation had gained momentum, though he remained unaware of Dexter's true identity. The journalist had interviewed several former Wolf Academy students, and disturbing patterns were emerging. 2 independent sources had described training incidents that bordered on assault. A former instructor had corroborated claims about Zane's anger management issues and inappropriate relationships with female students. Dr. Aubrey McKinney had also begun asking questions about injury patterns among Zane's fighters. His inquiries to the State Athletic Commission about training protocols had triggered a preliminary review of the Academy's certification status. Nothing definitive yet, but pressure was building from multiple directions. The beauty of Dexter's approach was its inevitability. He wasn't fabricating evidence or making false accusations. He was simply ensuring that existing truths came to light through legitimate channels. Zane's behavior would ultimately destroy him. Dexter was merely accelerating the timeline. David, you've really come along, Zane said after a particularly intense training session. I'm thinking about offering you a partnership opportunity. This was the moment Dexter had been building toward. What kind of partnership? Expansion. I'm looking at opening a 4th location, but I need investors who understand the vision. Someone who gets what we're building here. Zane's eyes held the predatory gleam Dexter had learned to recognize. Your divorce settlement could be the seed money for something really big. Dexter feigned enthusiasm while mentally cataloging every word for future use. That sounds incredible. How much are we talking about? $300,000 initial investment, and you'd own 20% of the new location. But more than that, you'd be part of building something meaningful. Teaching discipline to kids who need it, showing men how to reclaim their strength. The irony wasn't lost on Dexter. Zane was literally trying to profit from his victim's fake divorce settlement while positioning himself as a mentor to vulnerable youth. The man's capacity for self-deception was almost impressive. I need to see the business plan, financial projections, that sort of thing, Dexter said. But I'm definitely interested. Over the following days, Zane became increasingly animated about the partnership possibility. He shared details about his expansion plans, his vision for the MMA Academy empire, and his philosophy about strength and dominance. Every conversation was recorded on the device Dexter had sewn into his gym bag. More importantly, Zane began treating Dexter as a confidant. The carefully maintained public persona started to crack, revealing glimpses of the man who terrorized Mark at home. The problem with most people, Zane explained during one late-night conversation, is they don't understand that respect has to be enforced. Take kids, for example. They'll walk all over you unless you establish clear consequences for disrespect. What do you mean? Dexter asked carefully. Like with Mark, Loretta's kid. Smart mouth, thinks he knows everything. Sometimes you have to remind them who's in charge, you know? A little physical correction never hurt anyone. Builds character. Dexter's hand tightened around his water bottle, but his voice remained steady. Absolutely. Kids today are too soft. Exactly. Loretta's always worried I'm being too hard on him, but that's women for you. They don't understand that boys need firm guidance. A few bumps and bruises teach respect better than 100 lectures. Each word was being preserved for posterity, but Dexter wanted more than just evidence of Zane's casual attitude toward child abuse. He wanted the man to reveal the full extent of his pathology. Mark seems like a good kid, though, Dexter probed. Bright, respectful when I've met him. Zane's expression darkened slightly. He's got potential, but he's got too much of his father in him. That analytical, overthinking bullshit. Sometimes I wonder if Dexter filled his head with ideas about being better than everyone else. His father's a doctor, right? Trauma surgeon. Thinks he's God's gift to humanity because he saves lives. Zane's voice carried unmistakable resentment. But when it came to keeping his wife happy, when it came to being a real man, he couldn't handle it. Loretta needed someone stronger. The psychological profile was becoming clearer. Zane's abuse of Mark wasn't just about control. It was about competing with Dexter through their son. Every act of violence was, in Zane's mind, a demonstration of his superiority over the boy's father. Must be satisfying, Dexter said, proving you're the better man. Every day, Zane agreed. And when Mark finally learns to respect strength over intelligence, he'll be better for it. That night, alone in his study, Dexter reviewed the recordings while finalizing preparations for the exhibition match. Everything was falling into place with surgical precision. Orlando's investigation would break 2 days before the event, creating maximum damage to Zane's reputation. Dr. McKinney's concerns about training injuries would reach the athletic commission the same week. The business partnership discussions had given Dexter detailed information about Zane's financial vulnerabilities and illegal tax strategies. But the centerpiece of his plan required one final element: Mark's testimony. His son had been attending regular counseling sessions since the accident, gradually building the confidence to speak about his experiences. The therapist, Dr. Megan McGuire, had documented a clear pattern of escalating abuse. With the right encouragement, Mark was ready to tell the truth publicly. The exhibition match would be the perfect forum. Hundreds of attendees, local media coverage, and Zane's entire social and professional network in attendance. When the carefully orchestrated revelations began, there would be no escape, no spin control, no way to contain the damage. As Dexter prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Mark. Dad, I've been thinking about what we discussed. I'm ready to tell people what really happened. I want to help stop him. The pieces were all in position. In 3 weeks, at the height of his public triumph, Zane Wolfe would discover what it felt like to be systematically destroyed by someone who understood the true meaning of calculated precision. Dexter had spent months studying his target, identifying every weakness, every vulnerability, every pressure point. Now it was time to apply that knowledge with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to removing cancerous tissue. Some tumors could be treated with radiation or chemotherapy, but malignant growths like Zane Wolfe required complete surgical excision, and Dexter intended to cut deep enough to ensure the cancer never returned. Chapter 6: The Trap Springs. The Riverside Convention Center buzzed with anticipation on the night of Zane's charity exhibition match. Local dignitaries, business leaders, and MMA enthusiasts filled the arena, while cameras captured what was supposed to be Zane Wolfe's crowning moment. The respected businessman and community leader showcasing his athletic prowess for charity. Dexter arrived early, his David Mercer persona in place, but his surgeon's mind focused on the precision timing required for the evening's events. He'd positioned himself at a table near the VIP section, close enough to observe Zane's reactions, but far enough to avoid suspicion when everything unraveled. At 6:30 p.m., exactly as planned, Orlando Acevedo's article went live on the state's largest sports journalism website. The headline read, "Culture of Fear: Inside the Abuse Allegations at Elite MMA Academy." The piece detailed systematic patterns of training abuse, backed by interviews with former students and corroborated by medical records that Dr. McKinney had provided through official channels. Dexter watched as several attendees began checking their phones, their expressions shifting from anticipation to concern. Social media began amplifying the story, and the hashtag Wolf Academy Abuse started trending locally. At 7:15 p.m., as Zane completed his warm-up routine, his manager approached with visible agitation. The two men had an intense conversation in the corner of the warm-up area, Zane's body language becoming increasingly aggressive as he processed the implications of the breaking story. But this was only the beginning. At 7:45 p.m., as the opening ceremonies began, Dr. McKinney's formal complaint to the State Athletic Commission was leaked to local news outlets. The medical evidence of suspicious injury patterns among Wolf Academy students added credibility to Orlando's reporting, creating a second wave of damaging coverage. Zane entered the arena for the pre-fight introductions to notably subdued applause. Word of the allegations had spread through the crowd, and his usual confident swagger appeared forced. Loretta sat in the front row, her face pale with confusion and dawning horror as she realized the scope of the accusations against her husband. The exhibition match itself was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Zane's opponent, Rodrigo Boone, was a younger fighter who trained briefly at Wolf Academy before leaving due to what he'd privately described as concerning training methods. Rodrigo fought with unusual intensity, landing several clean strikes that clearly frustrated Zane. As the second round began, Dexter noticed Zane's technique beginning to deteriorate under pressure. The man who prided himself on controlled aggression was becoming sloppy, emotional, reactive. When Rodrigo landed a particularly hard combination, Zane retaliated with an illegal elbow strike that drew immediate intervention from the referee. The crowd's reaction was telling. Instead of the usual cheers for aggressive fighting, there were murmurs of disapproval. The allegations had changed the context. What might have been seen as competitive fire now looked like evidence of poor character and lack of control. During the break between rounds, Dexter's phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "I'm ready, Dad. Let's finish this." At 9:20 p.m., as the exhibition concluded with Rodrigo declared the winner by technical decision, the final phase of Dexter's plan activated. Mark Coffey, accompanied by Dr. McGuire and a victim's advocate, arrived at the convention center. They coordinated with Orlando Acevedo, who was prepared to conduct a live interview that would be streamed on social media and picked up by local news outlets. As Zane was still dealing with post-fight media obligations, Mark's story began broadcasting to a rapidly growing online audience. The 13-year-old spoke with quiet strength about months of systematic abuse, describing the careful pattern of violence designed to avoid detection. His testimony was devastating in its clinical detail, clearly the account of an intelligent boy who'd learned to document and analyze his own victimization. "He told me that if I ever said anything, no one would believe me," Mark said into the camera. "He said my dad was too weak to protect me, and that the police wouldn't care about a few bruises. But my counselor helped me understand that silence only protects the abuser." The live stream quickly went viral. Hashtag Justice for Mark began trending alongside the Academy abuse allegations, creating a perfect storm of negative publicity that no amount of crisis management could contain. Dexter watched from across the convention center as someone approached Zane with a phone, showing him Mark's testimony. The transformation was immediate and stark. Zane's carefully maintained public persona cracked completely, revealing the rage and violence that he usually kept hidden. The MMA fighter's first instinct was to find Mark and stop the interview through intimidation. But Dr. McGuire and the advocate had anticipated this, conducting the session from an undisclosed location with security provided by the police department's Special Victims Unit. Unable to silence his accuser, Zane turned his fury on the nearest available target, the journalist who'd started the avalanche. Orlando Acevedo was conducting follow-up interviews in the convention center's media area when Zane found him. The confrontation was captured by multiple cameras as Zane, still in his fighting gear, physically threatened the reporter. "You ruined everything," Zane shouted, grabbing Orlando by the shirt. "That kid is lying, and you're too stupid to see it." Security intervened quickly, but the damage was done. Video of a prominent community leader and business owner threatening a journalist while denying child abuse allegations spread instantly across social media. Every aspect of Zane's carefully cultivated image, the controlled fighter, the responsible businessman, the positive role model, was systematically demolished. The final blow came at 10:15 p.m. when Loretta made her own statement to the press. "I had no idea," she said, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. "I thought Mark's injuries were accidents. I believed my husband when he said the boy was clumsy, that he was imagining things. I failed to protect my stepson, and I will never forgive myself for that." Her public break with Zane completed his isolation. Within hours, sponsors began cutting ties with the academy. Several assistant instructors released their own statements about witnessing inappropriate training methods. Former students who'd been afraid to speak out began sharing their own experiences. By midnight, Zane Wolfe's empire was in ruins. The man who'd built his identity on dominance and control had been systematically destroyed by someone who understood that the most effective warfare was psychological rather than physical. Dexter left the convention center as chaos continued to unfold around Zane's crumbling world. He'd spent months studying his target, identifying every weakness, every dependency, every vulnerability. The evening's events had been orchestrated with the same precision he brought to complex surgeries, every cut calculated for maximum effect. As he drove home, Dexter reflected on the evening's success. But this was only the first stage of Zane's destruction. The public humiliation was devastating, but the legal and financial consequences would be far more comprehensive. Phase 3 was complete. Now it was time for the surgery to remove the cancer entirely. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 3 days after the charity exhibition disaster, Dexter sat in his attorney's office as Christopher Snow laid out the legal strategy that would ensure Zane Wolfe's complete destruction. The criminal charges for child abuse were only the beginning. They were pursuing civil remedies that would strip Zane of every asset, every source of income, and every possibility of rebuilding his life. "The criminal case is solid," Snow explained, spreading case files across his desk. "Mark's testimony, the medical evidence, the pattern of injuries documented over months. The district attorney is confident about securing convictions on multiple counts of child abuse and endangerment." Dexter nodded, but his attention was focused on the civil possibilities. What about the business assets? The academies are leveraged heavily. With the abuse allegations, insurance companies are canceling policies, sponsors are withdrawing support, and membership is collapsing. He'll be forced into bankruptcy within 60 days. This was exactly what Dexter had anticipated. Zane's empire was built on reputation and perception. Once those were destroyed, the financial structure would collapse like a house of cards. But Dexter wanted more than financial ruin. He wanted complete annihilation. The real estate holdings? Also leveraged, but here's where it gets interesting, Snow said with a slight smile. "I've been investigating the partnership opportunity he offered you. Turns out he's been running what amounts to a Ponzi scheme with potential investors. We've identified at least 6 individuals who've given him money for expansion projects that never materialized." Dexter felt a cold satisfaction at this revelation. Zane's greed had created additional vulnerabilities that could be exploited. How much exposure are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $2 million in fraudulent investment schemes. That's federal territory, securities fraud, wire fraud, potentially racketeering if we can establish a pattern. The conversation was interrupted by Dexter's phone. Orlando Acevedo was calling with an update on his expanded investigation. "Dr. Coffey, Orlando's voice carried excitement. "I've been contacted by the FBI. Apparently, your former stepson-in-law's problems extend beyond local child abuse charges." Dexter stepped outside the attorney's office to take the call privately. "What have they found?" "Tax evasion, money laundering through the academies, unreported income from underground fighting events. They're looking at a RICO case if they can establish the academies were being used as fronts for illegal gambling operations." Better and better. Dexter had suspected Zane's finances were questionable, but the scope of criminal activity was exceeding his expectations. "What's their timeline?" "Federal grand jury convenes next week. Local prosecutors are coordinating to ensure the state and federal cases support each other rather than competing." As Dexter ended the call, he reflected on how perfectly everything was aligning. He'd initiated the process by exposing Zane's abuse of Mark, but the investigation had uncovered a web of criminal activity that would ensure the man never recovered from his downfall. That evening, Dexter met with Mark and Dr. McGuire to discuss the upcoming legal proceedings. His son had grown visibly stronger over the past few days, as if finally telling the truth had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "How do you feel about testifying in court?" Dr. McGuire asked. "Ready," Mark replied without hesitation. "I want to make sure he can never hurt another kid." Dexter felt a surge of pride at his son's courage. The boy who'd been systematically terrorized by a man twice his size was now prepared to face his abuser in court. "You know I'll be there for every moment of this process." "I know, Dad, and I know what you did to make this possible." The statement caught Dexter off guard. "What do you mean?" Mark smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Dexter had seen from him in months. "I'm not stupid. The timing of everything, the way all these investigations started right after my accident, the way that journalists just happened to be looking into MMA Academy abuse. You orchestrated all of this." Dexter considered denying it, but his son deserved honesty. Some things needed to be exposed. Sometimes the system needs help finding the truth. "I'm glad you did it. Zane always said you were weak, that you wouldn't fight for what mattered. He was wrong about that, wasn't he?" "Very wrong." 1 week later, Dexter stood in the courtroom as Zane Wolfe was formally arraigned on 17 felony charges ranging from child abuse to securities fraud. The man who'd once radiated dangerous confidence now appeared haggard and desperate. His legal team was clearly overwhelmed by the scope of criminal charges they were facing. Loretta sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, having filed for divorce and seeking sole custody of her assets. Her testimony to prosecutors had been devastating. 3 years of observations about Zane's temper, his treatment of Mark, and his illegal business practices. The woman who'd once defended him unconditionally had become the state's most valuable witness. As the proceedings continued, Dexter observed Zane's psychological deterioration with clinical interest. The man who'd built his identity on dominance and control was discovering what it felt like to be systematically overpowered by forces beyond his influence. The fear and helplessness in his eyes was the same expression Dexter had seen on Mark's face during those terrible months. The irony was poetic. Zane was experiencing the same psychological trauma he'd inflicted on a 13-year-old child. During a break in proceedings, Zane's attorney approached Dexter in the hallway. "Dr. Coffey, my client would like to speak with you about a possible resolution." "I'm not interested in plea negotiations," Dexter replied coldly. "He's not offering to plead. He wants to apologize. He recognizes that his treatment of your son was inappropriate, and he's hoping for some kind of reconciliation." Dexter stared at the attorney with the same expression he reserved for particularly incompetent residents. "Tell your client that reconciliation requires forgiveness, and I don't forgive people who hurt my son. Ever." The attorney pressed on desperately. "He's facing life in prison if convicted on all counts. A word from you about his character, about his remorse." "His character is the reason he's facing life in prison," Dexter interrupted. "And his remorse is irrelevant. He made his choices. Now he'll live with the consequences." As they returned to the courtroom, Dexter caught Zane's eye across the room. For a moment, the full weight of understanding passed between them. Zane finally realized who had orchestrated his destruction, how completely he'd been outmaneuvered, and how helpless he was to stop what was coming. The man who'd claimed to be an apex predator had discovered he was actually prey. Later that evening, Dexter received a call from Christopher Snow with the final piece of devastating news. The feds found the underground fighting operation, Snow reported. Apparently, Zane was organizing illegal matches in the basement of his main academy, taking bets, and laundering the money through legitimate business accounts. The gambling operation alone is enough for a 20-year sentence. Dexter smiled as he absorbed this information. Zane's arrogance and greed had provided the final evidence needed to ensure he would never again be in a position to hurt children. The man who'd terrorized Mark would spend the rest of his life in a cage, where his physical prowess would be irrelevant and his psychological dominance would be turned against him by genuinely dangerous predators. Justice, Dexter reflected, was sometimes more satisfying than revenge. Chapter 8. The Healing Cut. 6 months after Zane's arrest, Dexter stood in his son's bedroom, watching Mark pack for his first overnight camping trip since the abuse had been exposed. The boy who'd once flinched at sudden movements now moved with confident purpose, his recovery as methodical and complete as any successful surgery Dexter had performed. "Dad, Dr. McGuire says I'm ready to stop the intensive counseling sessions," Mark announced, carefully folding his camping gear. "She thinks I've processed everything and developed healthy coping strategies." Dexter felt a familiar surge of pride, tinged with relief he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. "How do you feel about that?" "Good. Really good." Mark paused in his packing. "I've been thinking about what happened, about what you did to stop it. I understand now why you didn't just call the police right away." "Oh, the system is designed to handle normal problems." But Zane wasn't a normal problem. He was like a cancer, and cancer requires surgical precision, not just medication. The medical metaphor wasn't lost on Dexter. His son had inherited his analytical mind and was applying it to understand the complex moral landscape they'd navigated together. "And how do you feel about the methods I used?" Mark considered this carefully. "You used Zane's own nature against him. You didn't make him abuse me, or steal money, or threaten that journalist. You just created conditions where his true character would be exposed. That's not revenge, that's justice." The distinction mattered to Dexter more than he could express. His son understood the difference between reactive violence and strategic precision. Mark had learned that strength wasn't about physical dominance or emotional outbursts. It was about having the discipline to plan, the patience to execute, and the conviction to see difficult decisions through to completion. The door chime interrupted their conversation. Dr. McGuire had arrived for their final family session, a symbolic closure to Mark's recovery process. "How are you both feeling about concluding our work together?" she asked as they settled in the living room. "Ready," Mark answered immediately. "I feel like myself again." "Better than myself, actually." Dr. McGuire smiled. "That's exactly what successful trauma recovery looks like. You've not only healed from what happened, but you've developed emotional tools that will serve you throughout your life." She turned to Dexter. "And how about you? How are you processing everything that's occurred?" Dexter considered the question carefully. The months since Zane's arrest had been transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. Watching Mark heal had reminded him of what it felt like to save a life rather than just preserve one. More importantly, he'd rediscovered his capacity for protective love, not the distant affection he'd maintained during his marriage, but the fierce, unwavering commitment that had driven him to destroy anyone who threatened his son. "I've learned something about myself," Dexter admitted. "I always thought my emotional detachment was my greatest strength as a surgeon. But it wasn't detachment that helped me handle this situation. It was clarity about what mattered most." "Can you elaborate on that?" "When Mark was brought to my ER that night, I had two choices. I could follow protocols and hope the system protected him, or I could take personal responsibility for ensuring his safety. The decision was actually simple once I understood what was at stake." Dr. McGuire nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you've found a balance between your professional objectivity and personal emotional investment. That's significant growth." As the session concluded, Dexter reflected on how much both he and Mark had changed. His son had learned that survival sometimes required confronting evil directly, That passivity in the face of abuse was complicity with the abuser. Dexter had learned that his capacity for calculated action could serve love as effectively as it served medicine. Later that evening, as Mark left for his camping trip with friends from school, Dexter received an update from Christopher Snow about Zane's legal situation. Federal trial concluded yesterday, Snow reported. Guilty on all counts. With the state charges, he's looking at 45 years without possibility of parole. The judge made specific note of the systematic child abuse in his sentencing remarks. Dexter absorbed this information with satisfaction, but no surprise. The outcome had been inevitable from the moment he decided to act rather than trust the system to protect his son. "What about Loretta?" he asked. Divorce finalized last month. She received half the legitimate assets, which amounts to almost nothing after the bankruptcy and seizures. She's moved back to her maiden name and started working as a therapist specializing in domestic abuse recovery. The irony was perfect. Loretta's experience with Zane had given her genuine insight into the psychology of abuse and control. Her professional work now focused on helping other women recognize and escape similar situations. In a strange way, her own victimization had become a source of healing for others. Any contact between Zane and Mark. Zane attempted to send letters from prison, but Mark declined to receive them. The boy made it clear he considers that chapter of his life permanently closed. As Dexter ended the call, he walked through his house, noting how much lighter the atmosphere felt. The tension that had permeated their lives during the abuse and investigation had been replaced by something resembling normalcy, but a stronger, more intentional version of normal than they'd ever experienced before. His phone buzzed with a text from Mark, made it to camp safely. "Thanks for everything, Dad. I love you." Dexter typed back, "Love you too. Have fun." Standing in his study, surrounded by medical journals and case files, Dexter reflected on the past year. He'd performed hundreds of surgeries in his career, saved countless lives, and built a reputation for clinical excellence. But none of that compared to the satisfaction of successfully protecting his son. Some people might question the methods he'd used. The manipulation, the orchestrated destruction of another human being's life, the systematic exploitation of Zane's weaknesses. These weren't the actions of a conventionally moral person. But Dexter had never been conventional. He was a surgeon, trained to cut away diseased tissue without hesitation or remorse. Zane Wolfe had been a cancer in Mark's life, and Dexter had excised him with the same precision he brought to removing tumors. The difference was that this time, he'd saved the life that mattered most to him in the world. As he prepared for bed, Dexter felt the deep satisfaction of a complex operation completed successfully. Mark was healthy, safe, and strong. Zane was neutralized permanently. Loretta was building a new life focused on helping others. The surgery was complete, and the patient would survive. Chapter 9. The Final Verdict. 2 years after Zane's imprisonment, Dexter stood in the graduation auditorium watching Mark deliver the valedictorian speech to his high school class. At 15, Mark had accelerated through his final years of school while maintaining perfect grades and developing into a confident young man who bore no visible scars from his traumatic experiences. "The greatest lesson I've learned," Mark told the audience, "is that strength isn't about physical power or the ability to dominate others. True strength comes from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and the wisdom to know when action is required." Dexter smiled as he recognized the philosophical foundation they'd built together through their shared experience. Mark understood that the world could be a dangerous place, but he'd learned to navigate that danger with intelligence and preparation rather than fear or aggression. After the ceremony, as they celebrated at Mark's favorite restaurant, Dexter's phone rang with a call from Christopher Snow. "Dr. Coffey, I have some news about Zane," the attorney said. "He was killed in prison yesterday. Apparently, some of the other inmates discovered his crimes against children." Dexter absorbed this information without surprise or particular emotion. Prison justice for child abusers was a well-documented phenomenon. Any official investigation? Routine inquiry, but these things typically resolve themselves. The guards weren't particularly motivated to prevent what happened. As Dexter ended the call, he reflected on the poetic symmetry of Zane's end. The man who'd built his identity on physical dominance had discovered that violence was ultimately self-defeating. His aggression had created the enemies who would eventually destroy him. Mark looked up from his graduation cake. Was that about Zane? He's dead. Mark considered this for a moment. Good. Now other kids are safe from him. The casual finality in his son's voice reminded Dexter that Mark had inherited more than his analytical mind. The boy understood that some problems required permanent solutions, that forgiveness wasn't always appropriate or wise, and that protecting innocence sometimes meant ensuring dangerous people couldn't hurt anyone ever again. That evening, as they walked along the river near their home, Mark broached a subject they'd never directly discussed. Dad, I know what you did to destroy Zane wasn't technically legal. You manipulated evidence, orchestrated media coverage, and basically ran a psychological warfare campaign against him. Dexter stopped walking. This was a conversation he'd been anticipating for months. And how do you feel about that? Grateful and proud. Mark met his father's eyes directly. You saw a problem that the normal systems couldn't handle quickly enough, and you created a solution that was thorough and permanent. You saved my life and probably saved other kids from becoming his victims. Some people would say I went too far. Some people have never been terrorized by someone who's supposed to protect them. Some people don't understand that evil exists and that good people sometimes have to do harsh things to stop it. The moral sophistication in Mark's response reminded Dexter that trauma, when properly processed, could create wisdom rather than damage. His son had learned lessons about justice, power, and personal responsibility that most adults never grasped. 6 months later, Dexter received an unexpected visitor. Loretta, now going by her maiden name of Mercer, appeared at his office requesting a private conversation. I wanted to thank you, she said without preamble, and to apologize. Dexter gestured for her to sit, curious about what had motivated this meeting. For what? For protecting Mark when I failed to, and for showing me what I'd become. Her voice carried genuine remorse. I spent 3 years enabling an abuser because I was afraid of being alone, afraid of admitting I'd made a terrible mistake. My cowardice put your son in danger. You were being psychologically manipulated by an expert, Dexter replied. Recognizing that doesn't minimize your responsibility, but it explains how you could be deceived. I've been working with abuse survivors for 2 years now, and I see the same patterns I lived through. The isolation, the gradual erosion of confidence, the way abusers make you complicit in your own victimization. She paused. I understand now why you couldn't trust the system to protect Mark. You knew that even if Zane was eventually prosecuted, the legal process would take months or years while Mark remained at risk. Dexter appreciated her honesty, but forgiveness wasn't something he was prepared to offer. Understanding what happened doesn't erase the consequences. Mark suffered because the adults in his life failed to protect him. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prevent other children from experiencing what he went through. Loretta met his eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for your acknowledgement that I'm trying to make amends. Your work with abuse survivors is admirable, Dexter conceded, but it doesn't change what happened to Mark. As Loretta left, Dexter reflected on the different ways people responded to moral failure. Some, like Zane, doubled down on their destructive behavior until it destroyed them. Others, like Loretta, recognized their complicity and dedicated themselves to preventing similar harm. But recognition and repentance didn't erase the past. Mark had suffered because the adults around him had failed to prioritize his safety. Dexter would never forget that lesson, and he would never forgive those whose weakness had enabled his son's victimization. 5 years after Zane's death, Dexter stood in another graduation audience as Mark received his engineering degree from MIT at 19. His son had chosen to specialize in biomedical engineering, developing technologies to help children with physical disabilities, a career path that channeled his experience with trauma into constructive action. During the celebration dinner, Mark raised a toast that brought everything full circle. To my father, he said, who taught me that protecting the people we love requires more than good intentions. It requires the courage to act decisively, the intelligence to plan effectively, and the conviction to see difficult decisions through to completion. Dexter raised his glass, recognizing in his son the man he'd hoped to raise, someone who understood that strength served love, that justice sometimes required personal action, and that forgiveness was a choice rather than an obligation. As they walked through Cambridge after dinner, Mark voiced the philosophy that had guided them both through their shared trial. People think forgiveness is about being a good person, he said, but sometimes refusing to forgive is about protecting other innocent people from dangerous predators. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is ensure that evil people face consequences severe enough to prevent them from hurting anyone else. Dexter nodded, proud of his son's moral clarity. Mark had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the world contained genuinely dangerous people, and that protecting the innocent sometimes required destroying the guilty. Some would call this philosophy harsh or unforgiving. Dexter called it surgical precision applied to life's most critical problems. The operation had been successful, and the patient had not only survived but thrived. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.